out to the papers. As I said at the top of the show, sustained attacks on the Chancellor all over the place. Here is the Sunday Telegraph. DUP orders May to rein in divisive Hammond. And that's very significant, of course, because Theresa May's majority depends at the moment on the DUP. And there's the Sunday Times there with Harvey Weinstein, raped me, lots of Harvey Weinstein. And at the bottom of the page here, Hammond is actually hitting back. There's a suggestion that he's planning a much more radical and, if you like, extreme budget with much higher spending, much more house building over the Greenbelt and much else there. That is, as it were, the Philip Hammond Defence League going on there. There's the Observer. They've got a little story, a very significant story here. MPs draw up plans to stop May signing no-deal Brexit, suggesting there is a cross-party group determined to box her in the House of Commons quite shortly and stop any suggestion of no deal. And then finally, there's the Mail on Sunday. A lot of papers have gone for this story. Doctors are being told to ask all patients whether they're gay, bisexual, straight and so forth. Is this sensible, common sense information the NHS needs to know on the basis of our medical histories, or is it prurient intrusion? You can decide. You can all decide. Now then, I'm going to start this by asking a very straightforward question, which comes out of today's paper. Deal or no deal? Deal or no deal, Craig Oliver?
Deal if possible.
Deal or no deal?
Anybody in business knows that actually, no deal is always better than a bad deal. And if we're not prepared to walk away, we will end up with a bad deal. And that's the crux of where we are today.
All right, Anushka, you pick up on that, because we've got a really interesting spread here in the Mail on Sunday. Michel Barnier, who we were always told was our friend among the EU negotiators, sounding very unlike our friend.
Well, it seems, Andrew, that if you put the question that you just did to Michel Barnier, according to the Mail on Sunday, he would say no deal. And as you say, a pretty alarmist maybe headline there, Barnier ready to push UK off cliff. Now, this is based on a senior diplomatic source who's essentially saying that Michel Barnier believes no deal would be more damaging to the UK than to the EU. So says, if Britain wants it, then that's what we'll do. And there is an idea in here that we kind of know that the EU wants Britain to pay a political price for Brexit and that he's edging in that way. But I should say the diplomatic source also says that he still would prefer there to be a deal. And in other papers today, the idea that Michel Barnier actually would quite like us to move on to trade talks now.
So complicated stuff. Now, this is, in the end, all about hard negotiation. Richard, you've been a businessman all your life. You're used to negotiations. How are we doing?
Well, the truth is we're not doing very well. And there's an article in the Sunday Times, Outfox Britain can still win at the Brexit talks. At the moment, the EU is winning because they don't believe that we're prepared to walk away. I had a minister tell me 2 weeks ago that we had a WTO plan, but we didn't want to publish it for fear of upsetting the EU. That's the worst possible negotiating tactic. They will only come to the table when they believe we're going to walk away. We've got to publish a WTO plan very, very soon.
And former minister, of course, writing today in the Sunday Telegraph, lays out exactly what he thinks we should be doing. This is David Jones.
David Jones, that's right, former minister.
And full disclosure, part of your organisation.
And indeed, full disclosure, part of Leave Means Leave. Yes, he's quite rightly saying, yes, we want a deal, but you've got to be prepared to walk away. And as I say, the EU at the moment doesn't believe we are, and the government, it's incumbent on the government to give comfort to businesses, to the public at large, to consumers, that actually no deal is fine. As a base case, after all, that's what every other country around the world operates under. If it's good enough for America and countries like Australia and Canada, it's good enough for us, Andrew.
And yet, if you look at the public and you look at the opinion polls, they're beginning to take fright at the possibility of no deal. And I think, Craig Oliver, you've got an example of why.
Well, I was just going to say first, I think that what's really going on in the negotiations at the moment, it's a bit like two prize fighters trash-talking each other in public, and actually a bit more is going on beneath the surface. But moving back to what we were asking at the beginning about whether or not there should be a deal or not, I'd like to look at the front page of the Sunday Times business section, and the chairman of Sainsbury's is saying that he worries that if we crash out and go onto WTO rules, we'll be in a situation where food prices could rise by a fifth. Then if you look at Andrew Rawnsley's column, which is in the Observer today, he's talking about having talked to the chief executive of one of our biggest ports, and he's saying that we would need to build lorry parks that are 20 square kilometres each if we were to crash out without a deal. There are real and significant problems of us not having a deal. And I think Richard is in danger of saying, oh, it'll all be fine. But the reality is the people running our businesses are saying they're very nervous about it.
And that's why the government's got to publish the plan now so that people can prepare. The truth is, businesses are adapting. Many businesses are working on the basis of, Plan B, which is WTO. The truth is the city is contingency planning.
It's a Sunday Telegraph story.
Supermarkets like Sainsbury's are actually, they are starting to source more domestic produce. So that's good news.
But why then would the chairman say he's particularly concerned about it? He hasn't got some kind of conspiracy against Brexit. He's saying, I'm running a business and I'm looking at the cold, hard numbers and I'm worried about it. And the danger is that what you're doing is just dismissing that out of hand.
OK, so I'm going to jump in here, because what we're seeing here is exactly the argument going on inside the Cabinet, really, about the two possible options. And we all know the Cabinet's divided. And, Anushka, there's been a lot of heavy fire on the Chancellor coming just a week ago. It was heavy fire on Boris Johnson. Everyone's saying Bojo must be out. Now it's Philip Hammond must be out. And it's not just from his ordinary enemies, is it?
No, I mean, remember that this referendum was supposed to settle the EU question within the Conservative Party. Not going very well. And there's an article here in the Sunday Times which says Cabinet Remainers are joining calls for Philip Hammond to go. Now, I think what we should remember is that there are people who will have campaigned for Remain in the Cabinet who were actually pretty on the fence, and they were just coming out in loyalty to Craig and his old boss. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that they are Remainers, but essentially this article is suggesting that around half the Cabinet would like the Chancellor to be moved in a reshuffle. We know that a lot of people would like to see Boris Johnson moved as well. And I think a really interesting thing in here, Gavin Barwell, who is Theresa May's Chief of Staff, says actually you should move them both, according to this, in a reshuffle. But Gavin Williamson, who is the Chief Whip, says actually don't do that.
No, it's too dangerous.
It is quite dangerous, because although they were very successful with the Grant Shapps issue, you know, and the so-called coup, actually we know there are a lot of people who would like Theresa May to go. Get rid of either of these men and that number could increase.
Richard Tice, you're an influential voice on the Leave side of the party. Do you think the Chancellor should go now?
Well, look, I mean, he's 4 weeks before a budget, and a really important budget. So, you know, he's got to be a much more optimistic. You know, he's got to show some bold moves on student debt, on housing, but he's also got to be much more optimistic about Brexit.
It's not his natural demeanour.
No, well, then someone needs to give him some happy pills, frankly, because the country wants some serious leadership. We're not getting it at the moment, and that's why the mood of the country is diminishing.
Craig Oliver, you've got the same sort of story on the front page of the Telegraph. The DUP this time going for him.
Well, exactly. The Sunday Telegraph is leading on the fact that the DUP, which is in some ways propping up the government at the moment, saying that they're not happy about Philip Hammond. And I think it's worth trying to take a step back at the moment and say how extraordinary this political situation is. A few paragraphs into the Sunday Telegraph story, it says, last night, Michael Gove, the Brexit-supporting Environment Secretary, was being touted as a possible successor to take the helm at the Treasury and oversee next month's budget. So people in the Conservative Party are actually seriously suggesting that within the next month you sack the Chancellor and put in Michael Gove. This is an extraordinary state of affairs, and it reminds me a little bit of 92 to 97, where the Conservative Party was so inwardly focused and tearing lumps out of each other that it wasn't really paying a huge amount of attention of what does this look like to the electorate and how are they thinking about the party at the moment.
Can we talk a little bit about the Sunday Times front page piece? Because what it suggests there is that Philip Hammond, perhaps defensively, is preparing for a much more radical budget than we expected, where he was going to tear up some of the borrowing plans. He's got more money to spend, big house building plans, tear up a lot of the student debt as well, as he's being urged to do by David Davis.
And yet at the same time, he's also going to try and show himself as a kind of, you know, sensible Chancellor, as opposed to the way that they're trying to portray the Labour Party. I mean, the Sunday Times is full of suggestions, but I think that each of them are very difficult to actually achieve. The big thing for Philip Hammond in this budget is he can't make any big mistakes. We know that people think Theresa May hasn't got many crises left, and certainly we have seen what happens when budgets go wrong. For example, when he was trying to change the rules for self-employed workers.
Yes. Craig, we've got one big supporter of Philip Hammond in the papers today, Michael Heseltine, writing in the Mail on Sunday.
Well, this, I think, is a really good example of both sides firing howitzers at each other, and it's a very, very powerful article by Heseltine defending the Chancellor and saying that he's being made a scapegoat for telling hard truths. And perhaps the most interesting part of it is where he quotes Robert Harris, who's a political commentator as well as a novelist, and saying that it's like the Marxists at the moment. The theory is perfect, it just isn't being implemented properly. It's the view of Brexiteers, and that's a danger of why people seeing the Treasury as a scapegoat when in fact they're just trying to say what the economic reality is at the moment.
Richard Tice, you're very rarely described as a Marxist on sofas like this, but how do you react to that?
Well, I think the point is, you know, we need some optimism out there. Actually, you know, we're employing 400,000 more people than this time last year. The city is doing well. Flotations, IPOs in the city are well up, almost 100% on last year, and the city's employing more people. You know, the truth is the economy is doing much better on the ground than people give it credit for. And there's hugely optimistic news. For example, house builders are sourcing more products domestically, as are farmers and car manufacturers. There's lots of good news out there. We need leaders in the cabinet to sell the story.
And you need a government that's united and sounding optimistic. If by, say, Christmas, we haven't got any further moves on actually negotiating a new trade arrangement with the EU, what should we do?
We can't leave it till Christmas. If we haven't got some form of agreement on a transition, frankly, by the end of November, the EU needs to understand that we will accelerate rapidly plans to go to WTO, and that's what business wants. They want some clarity, and so that they can start, properly planning and know where we're going. We can't wait till Christmas.
Right. Anushka, let's turn to one other big story today. On the front page of the Sunday Times and the Mail on Sunday, the NHS telling doctors that they must ask all patients for details of their sex lives.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's been absolutely confirmed, but the story suggests that every time you go to the GP, you would essentially be asked straight away so they could put it on your notes, which has led to a bit of a backlash against the intrusion of what this says is 45 million people. Tim Loughton, a former children minister, calling it political correctness and compliance with the Equality Act gone bonkers. I find it quite hard to believe that they're really going to ask everyone who goes in for an appointment that question. And, doctors do ask you some personal things, and presumably there are times when it is relevant.
Absolutely. So it's down to the individual doctors to use their common sense. Don't ask an 80-year-old woman who's been married for 60 years whether she's a lesbian, but if somebody comes in and their sex lives are relevant...
If you were running the NHS, clearly that's how you would do it. According to this article, they're saying everyone should be asked. I would like to know, from the NHS if that is exactly what they're asking for.
And it feels like the NHS has struggled to get its story clear this morning, because I've read through all of this and I'm genuinely struggling. Is this discretionary? Is this something that you are going to ask a 90-year-old woman, or is it really about younger people? Yeah. And it is medically necessary to know about their sexuality.
Now, there is one slightly unlovely face peering out of almost every newspaper one way or another. That's Harvey Weinstein. Is there anything more at this point in the story to say about it, Craig Oliver?
Well, I think what's coming clear is it's extraordinary how many people are coming forward and how long this has gone on for, and how this seems to have been covered up. And literally at the Oscar ceremony a couple of years ago, somebody making a joke about it, people knowing about it. But at the end of this, I think that perhaps the most interesting thing is at the end of the Sunday Times article, where they talk about a lawyer in America who's basically saying that Harvey Weinstein's talking about having a second act in his life, as if this is one of his movies and that you have a chance of redemption. And she's saying, no, you have to face justice, and that's the reality in this situation. So fiction and reality being blurred here is quite an interesting point.
It does feel like it is finally curtains for him, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But no one's asking the bigger question, actually, about Hollywood. Why is there so much pressure? Hollywood needs to take a long, hard look at itself. Yeah. This is probably not an isolated incident.
Absolutely
not. The actress is actually saying it's not.
And that's,
Indeed.
That's desperate.
All right, on that desperate note, thanks all very much.